Thank you so much for attending my webinar. I think it's a very important topic, and I'm glad you're taking time out tonight to listen to me. Just a housekeeping rule or two. I will complete this webinar, and after that, I will answer some questions. If I don't get to you for some reason, you can email me and ask questions, and I will certainly be happy to answer those. I'll write that email in the question and answer box, Karen at ADD Advocate. So I'll do that just in case I don't get to you, but I'll try to do my best to get to everyone. And that's it. So my webinar tonight, Civil Rights for Kids with ADHD, Part 2, IEP Evaluation and Eligibility. So I entitled this first slide as "Are the struggles continuing despite a followed 504?" But this can certainly apply to any child who doesn't even have a 504. There are no rules that say that you must have a 504 before you're eligible for an IEP. So that's not true. But from the I was kind of writing this as a perspective of some child with a 504. But again, all of this can relate to a child who is struggling but has no support in place currently. So, excuse me. Parents or teachers can document these struggles. And of course, in my line of work, I feel like more parents do than teachers, at least in the area of ADHD, because they know their child the best and they see more. But certainly anyone can see these kinds of issues and ask for an evaluation. So you're going to see, a continuation, with or without a 504, continuation of missed assignments, comprehension difficulties, work refusals, and just inappropriate behaviors. We know that ADHD has a behavioral component to it many times, not all the time, just depend on the child, of course, the individual with ADHD. Not everybody is the same, just like in any other situation. But certainly if you have a child with behavioral issues, with ADHD who is not supported, those behaviors are going to worsen. Lack of attention, lack of persistence, impulsivity, boredom, and executive functioning deficits. Now, those are really run by the prefrontal cortex, and that is the part of the brain that is unstimulated, and that is why these deficits occur, and they include organization, time management, planning ahead, chunking out pieces of a project. Lots of deficits like that that kind of show their ugly head when you need them. And as you get older, you need more and more of them, of course. So if this is what's happening, you have a child who either has struggles or a child who has struggles and you're facing a 504 and you know that it's been followed and you do not see improvement. What comes next? What comes next is a request for a psychoeducational evaluation by the school. And that is a free evaluation. They are mandated to evaluate any areas of suspicious disability difficulties. Now, again, many times I think parents who don't know make the mistake of requesting it and don't get it because first of all, they need to put it in writing. It must be a written request to the child study team. And very important is to include from your point of view the data that you have seen, you've collected, the teacher has collected, and you're collecting it from the teacher as a result of the teacher sending you maybe emails about things that are missing or behaviors in class or not appearing to comprehend, or the processing that they have is on the slow end. All sorts of things that could create concern. So all of that you're compiling both from emails, talking to teachers, maybe in a parent-teacher conference, and what you see at home are all important data to put in your letter. And again, include, if you do have a child with a 504, include that. For how long has that child had it? And if you've seen any success at all. So the IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, does not specify how long must it take for the school to respond to your letter of request. But it is considered to be a response that should be reasonable, which is considered to be 7 to 10 days. Now, the time frame of testing is 60 to 90 days from the signing of the evaluation by the parent. And yes, the parent has to sign for that, to the IEP Eligibility Meeting. Now, this is variable depending on your state. So you just have to check your state regs to know, is it 60 days or is it 90 days? And that's the tough part of this too, is, you see your child struggling and it's going to take, 2 to 3 months to have everything finalized. And that is a little bit frustrating. So I think that's why it's so important to get on this as soon as possible. And if you are really sure about the struggles that you see, and I all the time see parents, and in particular moms, having the ability to nail what they see as struggles, and they know their child needs more help. So if that is the case, then it almost is more important to go after a psychoeducational evaluation than it is to put a 504 in place and wait. But again, it's hard for me to say that because it does depend on the child, depends on the parent, what you think is happening. Certainly high percentage of kids with ADHD, up to 50%, do have a learning difference. So a 504 is not going to do anything for that learning difference. And the other issue is there are so many difficulties in place with a diagnosis of ADHD. It doesn't have to be a learning difference, but still require an IEP. So it's a big decision, and it is not to be taken lightly as far as whether or not you would take the time to put a 504 in place rather than put an evaluation in place. And I can also say, and also speaking to a new client today, this falls right into this, and about a couple other things that we'll be talking about. Her issue was that her school was refusing IEP eligibility, and their evaluation was not a full evaluation anyway. It tested some executive functioning, I think, not a lot. Also looked at the fact that she was getting predominantly A's, but sometimes she wasn't. So that is what I hear time and time again. And the tough part of that is that, first of all, you can have a child getting good grades. It does not mean that ADHD is not a disability. It means that it is a disability in the way that they have to get the work done to catch up to everybody else. Nobody knows in the background. And I asked this mom this question. So what is happening when she's doing work at home? Is she being given extra time? Because she does have a 504. Yeah, she gets a day and a half. Twice a week, she has a major meltdown because she's so overwhelmed and frustrated. And then the more I talked to her, the more I realized that she is very smart, but she's having a lot of executive functioning deficits and a lot of frustration around focus, organization, and time management. Of course, are two big things. So my advice to her was that she needed to put in writing that what she wanted, because I hear this too, parents don't know what to ask for, a full psychoeducational evaluation, and write down the data that shows that you are concerned about many different areas, and that's what you want tested. And also, too, it's pretty overwhelming, but this mom had taken her child to 3 different neurologists, had all of those evaluations done too. So it's already documented. But of course, you know that if you do outside evaluations, schools are not mandated to use that information. What I have seen generally, though, are schools that do use the information, and obviously with 3 different evaluations, it's kind of amazing that they're not. So that's just a little example of things that can happen. I think a lot of schools, if you have the right data in your letter, will certainly respond with an evaluation. But that is really important to make sure that you do add all of that data. And in her case too, as well, her child was diagnosed with dyslexia, and they decided dyslexia kind of goes away because she's reading now and she's fine. Well, she's reading because her mom got her research-based learning tutoring and got her reading. Doesn't mean that she's fully where she needs to be, because we don't know. So that's an example of the importance of a psychoeducational evaluation. So these are just examples of, like I was just talking about, refusals by the school, misconceptions that can lead to the refusal. High grades, and that was the one in her case. Grades are a little tiny piece of this, but not the picture, not the whole picture. Gifted status, many times schools look at a child who's got a gifted status and what's their problem? They can't possibly have a problem. Maybe some previous screening didn't show anything very significant. This discrepancy between ability and achievement is something that used to be the case long time ago, years and years and years ago. And they took that out of requirement, but some schools still look at that, the percentage of what they're achieving and what they can achieve. And there's a whole big math thing to it, and if you don't fit into that criteria, then you're not eligible. And that is not even anything that the IDEA supports. And again, beliefs and misunderstandings about this medical diagnosis of ADHD. Many schools, many teachers believe that with maturity, you can control your behavior and you can do your work. And we know that's not true. And again, pretty much what I've been saying, the ignoring of functional deficits despite good grades. So these are some of the things that you can hear and get a refusal for an evaluation. So then you have to ask yourself, what am I going to do now that the school has refused my evaluation? You can continue to document data. So that may or may not be realistic, depending on how long you were collecting data and some of the struggles that you see. Consistent communication between home and school, another biggie. Without that communication, and again, in this new client's situation, one of the teachers that she reached out to and trying to make sure that she did have communication didn't even know that this child had a 504. And that is just really sad. It shouldn't really be the parent's responsibility, I don't think, to make sure that everybody knows this, but it is in the end, in a lot of cases. And sometimes teachers know it and believe or have been told that a 504 is optional. Not true, of course. Private testing, like this mom did, and in this case didn't really help her a whole lot, but I think that with her correct letter, this will make a difference. Filing state complaint, being aware of procedural safeguards for your state. If any of you have been through this process, you're given procedural safeguards in a book, and lots of people don't read them. So you don't really know exactly what you have. But I can tell you, and I do talk about this later, but in this case too, next steps includes a PWN. And this is what I told the mom as well. The school cannot just say no to something if it impacts evaluation of a child or the placement of a child or the change in support. They have to file a PWN. Now, what is a PWN? That's pretty much saying, well, if you're going to tell me that you don't think that my child needs an evaluation, then you need to tell me why. And every state has that form. The federal government does, the IDEA does, and every state has their own individual form. They're all different. And it includes the type of action that they have taken to decide that your child, in this case, let's say, is not eligible for an evaluation. How did they decide and what did they consider? In some cases, in a lot of cases, if you go this route, it's easy to say no to a parent. But if you have to put that in writing after you've documented all that data, the school might change their mind. So you really need to hold their feet to the fire. And I'm not just saying that it's an issue with just the school. I mean, you could also have a parent that is maybe not understanding the situation or is asking for something that they shouldn't be asking for. So it's kind of putting everybody on the same page. But I'm speaking more of an advocate for our kids with ADHD. And of course, in this case, assuming that there is a lot of data and that there should be not a no to an evaluation. So remember that a procedural safeguard like PWN is your best friend. And I talk about it later in this webinar as well. There we go. And again, why you're refusing to initiate or change an identification, to evaluate, or to change educational placement. And also too, remember, if they even change the diagnosis, and I have seen that happen too, from an ADHD diagnosis to an emotional disturbance, PWN is another necessary document explaining why. So any kind of change that either you're asking for or they are initiating, either one requires a PWN. PWN should be given before the refusal or attempt to change. So this applies when a school refuses a request, and also, again, if they're initiating a change. And you need to know what assessments were used as a basis for that refusal. It is a confusing word, I think. The word prior means prior to the change being implemented, not prior to an IEP meeting. It occurs before the proposed change. And the IDEA explicitly states the importance of parents of part of the team and therefore a decision maker. It is after the development of the IEP that the PWN document must be submitted with explanations around those refusals. If you have them right during that meeting, then they need to be submitted. Something maybe you've asked for and they're refusing. So now, like this example now, I've moved from the refusal for an evaluation. In this case, I'm talking about refusal in an IEP meeting. So the child has an IEP and you're asking for something and they're refusing. So you know, refusals happen everywhere, right? So the PWN covers a lot of territory. Another refusal that sounds like let's wait and see. I'm sure many of you have heard that before. If you have an IEP, if you want to change something in that IEP, let's wait and see. We don't do that here. We'll look at it later. Let's see if it gets worse. All of that. that is something that needs to be documented in the PWN. Also, I just wanted to tell, I think this is really interesting too, a fun fact about IDEA. Um, you know, we kind of take it for granted because we have it. But can you imagine that this was first passed in 1975? This hasn't been around forever. Prior to that, kids with disabilities were not being educated. I found a figure in 1972. 8 million children would qualify for special ed, only half having needs met. Only almost 2 million were at home not being educated because we didn't have anything like this. 1975. In the big scope of things, that's like a yesterday. Even though sometimes I know it feels like we don't have enough, and it's always been underfunded, and that's another issue. But imagine that. So now we go from all those years, from 1975 forward, we have something in the federal government that is protecting our kids with disabilities. And also make our parents, us, equal members. And I know, I've read this, many of you don't think that you are equal, and I get that. But that's because you need to pay attention to your procedural safeguards because they're very important. So let's say that you have had an evaluation and you're coming up to this IEP eligibility meeting. Now, I've never seen it separated. I think maybe you got a call or something. I guess every school probably does it differently, but the IEP eligibility meeting is an IEP meeting to discuss the IEP. So you've already gotten to the point of knowing that your child is eligible. You may have a separate meeting, and you may not. But usually I see it kind of together. So you get invited to this meeting with a name of all of the attendees: the parent, special education teacher, gen ed teacher, related services, and an administrator who can make decisions. These are all must be present people. So the parent needs to reply to this invitation. Important, unless your school offers it, to make sure that you request a draft IEP. Now you can say, well, like, I thought the parent was part of the team. How come they're already writing out a IEP and I'm not there? Well, I think it's reasonable because it saves time. A draft IEP is what it sounds like. Of course, that's without your input. And you can have, along with addressing this invitation, you can also, very important, is to submit a letter of what you want to discuss in this meeting, so that no one is surprised. So many times not a lot gets done in IEP meetings, and it's kind of a dumping ground because people get to the meetings and nobody has really talked to each other, and no one's aware of what the parent's concerned about. And the discussions are very disjointed. I've seen it. I've lived through these IEP meetings and they're terrible. It's just a big waste of time until you can get organized. And I think one of the things that can happen is if you submit a letter of concern prior to this meeting, it will be very helpful. And this can also be the material that you want put into the parental input statement, which we'll talk about as well. Again, we are part of the team, and your voice has to be heard. Again, the IDEA designates that the IEP needs to support the unique needs of a child and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So when you're going to the meeting, you have already sent your parent concerns letter that you want put in the parental input statement so that we know what we're talking about. You're going to go with hopefully someone with you. Now, you don't necessarily have to have an advocate with you, but it's good to not be alone. And I've said this before, like I do remember the very first time I was at an IEP meeting as a parent, very first time. It was pretty intimidating. And all I still remember is a sea of people. And I had nobody with me. I wasn't prepared, nothing. So again, IEPs are fluid anyway, and you can certainly have other meetings. So it's not the end of the world. But especially if this is your first IEP meeting, it's your first IEP, try not to go by yourself, because I think when you have, unless you're recording, which you can do, but you need to let them know you're doing that because they will also record if you tell them that. But if you're not recording and you just want to take some notes, having someone with you with another set of ears is very, very helpful. Another very helpful thing to do is follow up with a letter describing what you heard and what you understand. That's because you and the school need to be on the same page. And if you've misunderstood something or they have, it's important to know that. Now, here's another big one too. Make sure you check your state regulations for rules around signing the IEP. Many times parents are given, on social media and all sorts of areas, advice like, if you don't like the IEP, don't sign it. And that's not a good piece of advice. It does depend too on the state that you're in. Sometimes signing it just means that you were there. And it could mean that if you don't sign it, it doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It just means that there's a delay of 10 days. So, I mean, that's okay, but you need to know that. So you're delaying the IEP for 10 days. If you do know that and you have a reason for it, that's one thing to maybe make some changes and call another meeting or add more data, something like that. But if you think that you're not signing it because you're trying to stop it, that is not happening. I do know, and I think it's probably in all states, pretty sure. The one time that you do need to sign an IEP to initiate the IEP is when it's the first one. And then after that, again, it could mean attendance, it could mean nothing other than if you don't sign it or you do sign it, it happens in 10 days. So that's where you need to make sure that you know what your state regs say. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things inside the IEP document. Present levels, academic as well as functional. And these are put in by teachers, strengths and weaknesses and struggles, data, measurable and observable data from multiple sources that identify strengths and deficits. This could include observations, mastery of previous goals, report cards, reading level, behavioral data, and current accommodations and modifications. All important data. How the disability impacts progress. How does this child access general education? And again, here's the parent input statement. And again, that's what I was talking about before. If you send in a parent concerns letter, along with RSVPing the meeting, you can have that document pasted into the IEP under the parent statement. So those statements are not to be, as I say, a dumping ground for complaints. Like this statement is not about I'm concerned because my son is eating by himself in the lunchroom or something like that. It's kind of more of a widespread general wishes that kind of encompass the present as well as the future, like what you want for your child, what you see as his strengths, what you see as his weaknesses that you want remediated. Yeah, and remember the weaknesses, not just academically, but functionally, socially, sensory issues, all important things. And again, you're the parent, you know more than anybody. So it's really, really important to make sure that you get your input statement put in this IEP, because this is part of what is the driver for the goals. The present levels that I just talked about, obviously they are drivers for the goals, for sure. But so is this. This is coming from you. This is your voice. And you know better than anybody. Goals, a huge part of the IEP. They must be measurable and linked to the needs of the child in the areas that are impacting access to education. And that's where are you going to find all of that? In the present levels in the parent input statement. SMART goals just means that they need to be specific, they need to be measurable, attainable, results oriented, what the child does to be successful at a goal, and a time frame. Within what time frame is this goal to be achieved? And a side note too, I've seen IEPs that are outrageous. I mean, 20 goals, holy moly. That's just unreasonable to list 20 goals. They're not going to be paid attention to, they're not going to be achieved. Much more, I think, to think about, maybe top 3, maybe 4 goals that are a priority. And then when they are achieved, you can go on and make modifications to another goal. But don't let the school put down 20 goals. That's just not happening. So progress monitoring, also extremely important. This is part of the communication between the school and you. If you don't have progress monitoring, how are you ever going to know if the goal, was achieved? And in the way that I speak about this, then you see how ridiculous it would be to have 20 of them. It would be just too difficult to monitor. So for every goal in the IEP, you need to have documentation on how the goal will be measured. What's the objective? Will the assessments be objective and through different environments in the school? Who will be doing those assessments to see if there's progress? Who will be measuring this data? Who will be talking to the parents about the results of those assessments of goal attainment? And can it be repeated? And important to note that we have to be careful about subjective data. We don't need people who are measuring data saying, I think he's better, or I think he seems to be doing X better. That's just not going to be helpful. You need objective progress monitoring. In every single goal, you need an answer to those questions. Who is going to be the one that looks at how my child is achieving this goal? How are we going to know that? How often is this going to happen? In what environment is this going to take place in? And who's going to be connecting with me about that? And also, too, as I say here, many times the progress reports come at the same time as report cards. So you're getting them quarterly. Now, that may not be good enough. In the very beginning with an IEP, or maybe in the beginning of a new goal, you may feel like, I can't wait quarterly to find out what's going on. Unless you're emailing every teacher every day, special education teachers that are involved with your child. So you might come up with a different plan for a period of time where you really need to see progress reports every couple of weeks, and that's okay. Now, you have accommodations in a 504 only. But if you have an IEP, obviously you have much more. You're in special education, but you still can have, sometimes I've heard people say they have a 504 and an IEP, but you don't, because when you have an IEP, that can include those accommodations that maybe your child had when he had a 504, if he had one. And again, an accommodation is an allowance of an individual, a way for a child to access education when a disability creates struggles. It doesn't change the type of information or the type of education that he's accessing. It's really changing how he's accessing it. And it's difficult because of his current disability. So accommodations level the playing field. And how does that happen? Extra books at home, because if you have a child who's impacted with executive functioning deficits, with organization, time management, among other things, you're going to probably have a child who forgets important material to bring home. And of course, extra books doesn't cover it all, because we know that they can forget lots of things, their personal notebooks and things, and they could forget an assignment. But at least if you have extra books at home, that does cover something. That would be one way of helping with the need to remember and bring home what you need. Peer notes can be good too, because many of our kids have processing difficulties, and taking notes in class is kind of a nightmare because the teacher is talking and they can't keep up with that. So peer notes are very helpful. Or they can record their own lectures, which I'm sure a lot of kids do that too. Seat preferences, whether it be in the front or maybe it's in the back. I don't know. It kind of depends on the child and what it is that's impacting that child. Extra time, I don't know, extra time can be good and not so good. I mean, I always hear that extra time is so great. I always worry about kids who are given extra time, at least in our area of ADHD, because they can still fill that time and then they're still behind anyway. And they can have a sense of frustration too, because if they have an extra day and a half and the homework's still rolling in, again, it might be okay, kind of depends on the child, but I think that everything else has to be ruled out. If you were having these accommodations in a 504, you would want to be sure that, is it the focus, the impulsivity that's creating the inability to finish these assignments that mandate longer period of time? Or is it something else? Maybe this child can't move forward for other reasons. Maybe there is a learning disability that has not been tested for. Maybe there just needs to be more modification of assignments, of which we'll talk about too, that show understanding, but takes away the stress of that time factor. Different ways of testing can be an option. Oral testing, written testing, aside in a different room without a lot of noise and distraction for them. Modifications, and that's a change in what is expected to be learned. Different than the accommodations, where that's just a change in how to access that education that neurotypical kids are receiving. So different examples, reworded questions. And that would be a great example of a child who's having trouble completing assignments on time. maybe there is a comprehension level, and you can have ADHD and have some comprehension issues and not have a learning disability. So that's one of the things that could be helpful by having a question reworded. Different books on a grade level that are reasonable for that child, because they might be reading on a third grade level and third or fifth grade. Research-based language programs for learning disabilities. Curriculum changes, assignment changes, modifying projects and assignments, modified homework problems. Also, I didn't mention this too, but be aware also if you have a child who is to receive, for example, speech, make sure you understand, again, we're talking about progress monitoring, and that's all important, but make sure you understand if they're to get X number of minutes of speech a week, make sure you understand how that's going to be delivered, whether it be delivered one-on-one or there's a group. That can be really important, because when you're evaluating results of that goal, if you want to make changes, you need to know what changes would make a difference. I wonder if, there's two other kids in the room versus a one-on-one, what kind of difference does that make? Or is it happening in the classroom? So just be aware of that too. Side note, I meant to mention that. Other supports that may be part of your IEP: speech, as I said, occupational therapy, reading comprehension programs, counseling, behavioral intervention, and social or sensory type support. And again, just being aware that you need to know minutes and frequency and environment so you can better understand if they're not achieving the goal, maybe there's a reason for it, or not. Placement is determined to best serve this child. It must be least restrictive environment. So that's why inclusion classes where there are kids with IEPs inside of a gen ed class is considered least restrictive. Now, if you have a child who is dyslexic, some kind of a learning difference that needs one-on-one, then LRE may not be in the classroom for a certain period of time. It may not suit that child. It just depends on what is going on with that child. Now, when you're in the meeting, along with everything I've been talking about regarding the IEP, is the collaboration along the lines of understanding what did the test show. And I just want to reinforce the need, the importance for everyone to make sure you ask questions for things that you don't understand, because these are things that you don't work with every day, and you certainly have a right to understand them to a certain extent. So make sure you ask questions and understand. What I've seen so many times is, even if a child doesn't have a learning disability, they can have processing and working memory issues, and the scores these are like sub-scores among a lot of them, and they drop off, and then they average it under the main title of all of these scores. They come up with somewhat average, but you can pick out these grades, these evaluations that are low, and you can connect them to what you're seeing in the classroom, and it makes sense. So that's really important, when you're looking at that evaluation, what is that really telling you? Do you see working memory and processing difficulties in only certain classes? That means something. Important too, while you're talking, to establish communication. And again, we talked about this. real important to have in the IEP. How effective are these goals? How will they be tested? By whom? How often? And when will I know? When will we set up these reports? Remember, the input statement represents how the IEP needs to prepare a child for further education, employment, and independent living. This is your voice since you are a member of the IEP team. So my takeaways, my overview here, you, the parent, are a member of this team. You may not feel like it because you feel like you don't know anything, but you do. You know everything about your child, and that is why you are the most important person on that team. Remember that the IEP document is fluid. You can have meetings as often as you deem necessary. There is a requirement to have one annual IEP. But if you need 3 IEP meetings in a year or 4 IEP meetings, then that's what you have. I mean, it's like nice to avoid that many if you can, but sometimes you need them. They cannot, the team can't make changes without you, ever. Again, the present levels and the parent input statement drive the goals. Communication is key to determine effective goals, for sure. And I think I harped on that enough. And you know your child best, which I still harp on. Your parental advocacy can lead to the very important self-advocacy of your child. Our kids develop positive self-esteem as a result of understanding themselves, being taught tools that create academic success, and feeling okay about asking questions that need answers. They know they are smart, sensitive, and intuitive. They are. They know they have a medical diagnosis that carry both strengths and weaknesses. And with their toolbox early on, they can successfully take on their passions. And bringing back the woman that I talked to you about earlier, the mom, another thing, and I'm really big on this too, because, you know, when your child graduates high school, goes on to college, has maybe a 504 in college, they do have to advocate for themselves, and they're learning from you. So this particular child, in one class where the teacher didn't know that she had a 504, she advocated for herself to a certain extent, but then got intimidated. She asked for her extra time for whatever they were doing, and she was denied. So I don't know the whole story. I'm sure she didn't go farther than that because she was probably scared, intimidated, embarrassed, you know, all that negative stuff that our kids with ADHD do put on themselves. And that is a big deal to me. I think that what early on, we as parents really need to make sure that your child sees what you're doing, how they're advocating, you're advocating for them, and how they're worth it and how they're capable. And it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask for accommodations, to better learn about yourself and what you can do. And then that's how they're going to be successful. Finally, before I finish and answer any questions, I'd like to introduce my new virtual platform called my Masterclass. It will serve to help families with kids with ADHD. And like I continue to say, ADHD is a medical diagnosis that is always, it seems to me, misunderstood many times. And what I see is behavioral issues that become a central focus to our kids. Unless you have a child with just inattentive ADHD, then you have a child with impulsive, unfocused, hyperactive, or maybe you have inattentive and that as well. But if you have any piece of that that is visible, that's the focus. And sadly, many believe, no matter who you are, that behaviors should and can be controlled, particularly as you grow older into like middle school. But we know that that's not true with our kids. we are going to be talking in my third webinar of this series. We will be talking about the behavioral symptoms that are creating that kind of havoc. But for now, I'd like to introduce you to my masterclass and explain it. Excuse me. Unfortunately, I caught a cold from my little grandbaby. So this is an overview of my ADD Advocate Masterclass to help you, the parent, advocate for your child. On-demand access to 10 masterclass courses with ongoing added content. A masterclass group coaching and member community support. So important because, you know, we as parents many times are made to believe that it is our fault for our kids acting in the way they do. If you belong to a Facebook group that is formed by all these parents with kids with ADHD, it's a safety net, and everybody supports each other. Included in that, live bi-weekly Zoom coaching calls, and we'll just touch on a variety of subjects, subjects that I decide are important, and subjects that you ask for as well. Masterclass.addadvocate.com. This is just kind of an overview of how the law protects civil rights, the differences between 504 and IEP, the difference which we've touched on about accommodations and modifications, procedural safeguards, evaluations, key elements, the parents as an important part of the team, and much, much more, many more topics. So this is my masterclass, everything you need for $87 a year. I hope that you can consider that and join our masterclass and be a part of the Facebook group of everyone who joins this masterclass, because I think that sometimes along with the advocacy part for you parents is a piece of being very lonely, because there's nobody who, if that person doesn't have a child with ADHD, they don't understand, and they're not going to be supported. So I think it's very helpful in your journey of advocating, not only advocating for your child, but to show your child that you are advocating and it's important, and that that child down the road knows how to advocate for himself. Now we'll look at questions. Does the school need to provide PWN to assess in order to evaluate skills for an annual IEP if they're using non-standardized checklists? Wow, I've never heard of that before. To assess in order to evaluate skills for, so it's a checklist they're using to decide, I guess, if they've achieved some of their goals. I guess that's what you're saying. I'm not sure of the answer to that question. I think I would probably err on the side of yes. If it's a concern to you that there's a checklist that doesn't make sense. Any tips for low EF skills, ADHD, that leads to anxiety and overwhelm? That student shuts down and refuses to do work. School says that it's a choice, and they don't seem to understand that it's part of the OHI. Oh. Yeah. again, that's you're actually saying what I talked about behavior, and of course, that kind of thing, those symptoms of executive functioning deficits and not being addressed only promote behavioral issues further. So he's refusing to do work. Does that mean that he does not have an IEP and doesn't have support for, oh, you say OHI eligibility? So you were not granted the IEP for that child, I guess. Certainly, executive functioning deficits rear their ugly heads as the child gets older, has to deal with multiple teachers and projects. They just can't keep up. So again, if they're denying, I'm not sure if they're denying the evaluation or they're denying the IEP. Either one would require a PW1 in that case as well, because he needs some definite support in school for those skills. And apparently, the school needs some education on what ADHD is, because they're looking at him as neurotypical. It is not. It is not. So that's a shame. I think that if you have been refused an IEP, you need to put all of that in writing again. They are not providing FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. If a child is not being supported in the disability that they have, then they're not receiving FAPE and they're not being treated equally as their neurotypical peers. So that's a big deal. So whatever the issue is, whether you need an evaluation or you need a PWN for ADHD eligibility, and document along with a PWN, requesting a PWN is a parent letter to document just that. Hopefully I answered your question. Anybody else have any questions? No? If you think of any, there's my email. If you have a question that you think of when you sign up. And also, make sure you sign up for my masterclass. I would like to have as many as I can join me in that journey of advocacy and learning. We all know in everything, right? The more information that you have, the better you have the ability to fight for what you need for your child. Many times I think that answers from schools hope that you don't have that information and they can get away with what they get away with. Because some of the things that are said and done makes me shocked, and I'm shocked that they really don't know that. So I think they do. And it's just, I don't know, money related, staffing related. I don't know what it is. But your child deserves the right to access his education in the way that he is able to with support. So if there are no more questions, please again consider signing up for my masterclass, $87 a year, where we will again talk about lots and lots of topics. And I will ask for people who want to add ideas to those lists of topics. Would be great. A forum to talk on Facebook, and ongoing webinars that you can listen to at your leisure. All of that comes bundled together to a great class. But again, thank you for being here tonight. I appreciate your listening, and we'll talk again for my third part of the series that will be on behavior. Thanks again.